Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another thought-provoking episode of Untethering Shame, where we unravel the intricacies of shame and its impact on our relationships and personal growth. I'm your host, Kira Wackett, and today we're diving deep into the delicate terrain of moving on from toxic relationships and the complexity of healing in the process of this work. Moving on is hard. In a grief-averse hustle culture, we're constantly tasking ourselves with being fine and staying the course to some bullshit checklist of successes we're all holding on to as if it's the key to unlocking happiness. Reflection, growth, emotional processing are all back burner topics that we push aside to stay the course. And all it does is keep us stuck in cycles of toxic behaviors, relationships, and shame. If we never give ourselves the opportunity to heal from painful experiences and unhealthy relationships, to reflect and take with us what's helpful and let go of the rest, there's no hope of a different path moving forward. Joining us for this illuminating conversation is Lucy Price, a compassionate and insightful relationship coach who's dedicated her life to guiding individuals through the process of healing and reclaiming their power. Her journey from the depths of anxiety and heartbreak to becoming a beacon of transformation is nothing short of inspiring. And I'm so excited for her to share bits of her story and learning, as well as the amazing work that she does with the people she's working alongside with. So join me in learning a bit more about Lucy's story and how she's used her knowledge and experience to create a business that supports her clients in learning to love and be loved in all the ways they dream of. Welcome, Lucy. I'm so excited that you're here.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been pumped about it ever since our sort of pre-podcast chat and just thinking about all the places that we can go. And so I love to start every episode just sort of doing an emotional check-in. So I'm curious for you, if you could describe how you're feeling right now with one word, what would that be?
Energized.
Energy. I love, honestly, that's the word. I was kind of, that and vibrating was my sort
Yeah.
of piece. So tell me, what's making you feel that way?
Well, so I'm based in Michigan. And if anyone knows anything about Michigan or the Midwest, we have very interesting seasons where
Oh.
sometimes in March and April it's sunny and sometimes it's snowing. And I got blessed today with the sunshine, which I joke around and say I'm kind of a light beam cat. Like I like the sun. I like having vibrancy. I like the freshness of spring. Spring is my favorite season. So to be coming
Mm-hmm.
into that season and really feeling that in the climate today has just kind of awoken a spirit within me, especially because the last few days have been very gray. But I'm
Yeah.
also just excited to talk about this topic. I recalled our conversation as well before this when we were pre-planning, and we just like had such a good riff at that. So it's also
Mm-hmm.
just energized to be here, to be talking to you and doing what I love. So can't complain.
Yeah, it's nice. I think I have started to feel, so I think the past 6 months, I've had more days being sick than non, which I'm blaming my 4-year-old. And I don't know what happens, but she gets sick for like 6 minutes, it feels like, and I am sick for weeks. And so I'm like, the roles have reversed. I am clearly not immunologically robust because something is happening. And so today, I think being sick for a period of time and then daylight savings time really kicked my ass this time. And
Yeah.
so today was the first day I felt a little bit of that, like, oh, I feel a little like normal today. Like I feel kind of good. And we have some 70-degree weather coming our way out in Portland in the next few days. And interestingly, I had a conversation with someone from Michigan this morning who was like, her 3-year-old is in the background, like, mom. And she's like, I'm sorry. He's just like cabin fever. I need to get outside. I'm like, oh no, get outside. Like just move our call to like the phone and just be out there because yeah, it does. It changes, it makes these hard conversations, even though you and I get jazzed about it, but
Mhm.
these really important and deep conversations that will naturally kind of add in the gray, and we have to be there for that. It's kind of nice when the weather around us kind of creates that counterbalance, and I think it allows us to go even deeper in these discussions too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I loved how you mentioned as well, like sometimes we just need that tweak, like that, oh, things I feel even just kind of normal today.
Yep.
And from that place, like allowing it to snowball and build into, a place of just feeling, whether that be content or good or whatever it is. I also just loved how you said that.
Yeah.
And having the contrast of these are heavy topics, like talking about relationships, toxic relationships, divorce, like these can be really heavy emotional topics. So to be able to
Hmm.
do that with the backdrop of sunshine, it is a really nice
Yes.
it's balance, right? Like you said, it brings in some balance, which is
Yes.
necessary.
Okay, so I'm curious because I just want to go all in on the work that you do. How did you make a decision? Because there's a lot of people that work in the relationship sector, whether that's therapists, coaches, all sorts of helping professionals. Relationships are something we all struggle with in different ways. But you've niched down even more to really focus on toxic relationships and, in particular, ending and healing from toxic relationships.
Mhm.
How did you decide to make that be your focus? What made you decide that's my priority and that's where I can do the most good for the people I work with?
So it was a couple different things. Of course, I have my own personal experience, right? I think that's what leads a lot of people into the work of coaching or being a therapist. It's that personal connection and care, I think, is a huge drive. And I know it was a drive for me. But
Mm,
I also just saw in the space, because when we do have a lot of relationship coaches, a lot of therapists, a lot of people talking about this, which is fantastic. And I
mhm.
also noticed that there was a bit of a gap in the space. I noticed there was a gap around breakups and divorce in particular, because a lot of the messaging out there around breakups and divorces, you just need to get over it. You just need
Yeah,
to move on. You need to distract yourself. It just takes time. You just need to sleep with someone else. And it's like, that's been the running narrative for decades.
yeah,
And it's not helping. It's just not really supporting people in the way that I think mainstream media thinks it is. And then on the other side of it, I think that we don't talk enough about how some relationships aren't healthy. And it's easy to get lost in that, to not recognize that. I also think we see a huge wave on social media right now of, someone else's feelings is someone else's feelings. You're not, what you say and what you do, it's up to them to navigate their own emotions and own their
right.
own shit. And there's a yes and to that. It's like, yes, someone could have a completely different emotional reaction to what you say. And also, if there are patterns, if there's dynamics that either you're falling into or you're choosing or someone else keeps portraying, at what point do you take a step back and go, okay, hold on, actually, am I okay with how I'm being
Yeah.
treated here? Like I'm having this emotional reaction, but maybe I shouldn't gaslight myself about this. Maybe I should actually look at this and really ask some deeper questions of, does this work for me? Does this feel good? Is this healthy? Is this good for my mindset? Is this good for my emotions? Is this leading my life down a direction I want to go? And we don't have those conversations as much as I think it would be beneficial to have those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking about the fact that I think a lot of, particularly in the US, because I can only speak to my training here and obviously the culture here, but I do think that there is this overlap of sort of patriarchal Christian views that
Mhm.
even if that's not your identity, and even if you're like, I want to break down the patriarchy, we still have some biases around that. So there's still this idea that marriage is good or long-term relationships are good, divorce is bad. You shouldn't get
Mhm.
divorced. What is that saying about you? And or it has to meet some ridiculous level of bad that people say, "Oh, well that's okay then because you were
Mhm.
beat. This happened." Like something so extreme that
Mhm.
then it's okay. So there's this, I think, overwhelming pressure to sustain whatever the relationship is. And I think about this even as someone that had a long-term relationship that started when I was 14. And when I left that relationship at 21, it was like, why was that everybody's idea that I should stay with somebody when I was well, I wasn't even a person yet. My
Mhm.
job was to not have a full identity. It was to explore my identity. But this
Mhm.
idea that then I was doing something wrong because I left this relationship. And so I think there's a lot of pressure for people. And I think likely a lot of bias in the professionals that are working with people, that that's the goal, is to salvage or save the relationship and to give people the tools and the tips to work harder at maintaining those relationships. And so what I like is what you called out sort of as the second point, which is there's truth in this. There is truth that in relationships, we own our part, they own theirs. And so we can't take responsibility for those people. We can show up authentic. There's these pieces, but there's also this idea that the coming together of those two selves, there is a reaction, a chemical reaction, energetic reaction, whatever we want to say. And it is important to be mindful about how that is affecting you. And so, are you able to be your best self in that relationship? Are they able to be their best self? For many people, I'm assuming then, they're coming in with that notion of like, gosh, but I should be trying harder. The problem is me. Or maybe they did finally make that decision. They decided, okay, it was bad enough. Ending the relationship is what I should have done, but they're still beating themselves up about it. And now they're saying I should be over it. So the pressure and the shoulds is sort of astronomically compounded on them. Then coming to you, I can imagine, feels like a really hard step. Like it almost feels like it's like opening the door to shame of like, I don't have this figured out. So when they come to you, what's their biggest, like, what's the driving force to come to you to say, no, I need to work on this because this isn't good? How do they get there?
I noticed a few different trends. I would say one of the biggest reasons someone comes to me is because they are, it sounds so simple to say, but they really are struggling in their day-to-day life. They have had this narrative of they just need to be over it, and they're feeling a lot of anxiety, a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, and it's impacting their ability to live their life, their ability to go to work and focus on work and get enjoyment from friendships and hobbies and the things that used to motivate them.
Mm,
And so I would say some of it is just the struggles they're facing and noticing this is taking impact, and I don't want to be this anxious anymore. I don't want to feel this upset anymore. And I've tried everything that Cosmopolitan magazine
yeah.
or a Google search has told me to do, and it hasn't been working. So I want to take this step forward. And I agree with you. I think for a lot of people, it is a little scary to reach out to somebody and say, I'm struggling with this,
Yeah.
because so much of our freaking society has told us that we have to do things alone and we have to be independent and that we shouldn't need support from other people, and that something's wrong with us if we do, or it's shameful. And I think that is a narrative that I do think is pushed forward from patriarchy, capitalism, individualism, but it's not helping. It's I think in fact it's causing a lot of disconnection and a lot of isolation, and shame thrives in secrecy and isolation. So I think part of it is just noticing that they are it's having an impact on their life. But I would also say that it comes up when they notice future relationships are being impacted as well.
Mm,
So dating feels scary. It feels all these narratives of I'm too old to date, or I'm going to mess this up. I was the problem. What if this happens
right.
again? What if I fall into a relationship with someone else and they treat me this way? And so I think part of it is as well having this deep desire for love and having this deep desire for connection, but these patterns and these mindsets it's heavy weight, and it's weighing them down from actually being able to step into that.
When it sounds like on the one hand, it's this, I'm not okay with how my life is right now, and sort of a risk aversion of like trying and being vulnerable again, whether that is
Mhm.
asking for help because they haven't, again, quote unquote, moved on and they're not
Mhm.
healed, or if it is dating again, like there's this fear. And do you think that that comes from the shame of the actual breakup or the ending for people? Like they've done this thing that they're carrying so much of a story around that now the rest of that feels harder. So then it feels easier, even though it's more painful, to isolate themselves. If they can just fix this and be better, then they can go
Mhm.
back out into the world again, and then they might be allowed to be a part of the culture. They might belong in some way.
Mhm. I think in part it is due to the breakup itself or the divorce itself. Because going back to what you said earlier around marriage, the mark for a successful marriage for the most part has been time.
Yeah.
Oh, you've been married for 25 years. You've been married for 50 years. Wow. What is the secret to your success?
Right.
Meanwhile, behind closed doors, they're having screaming matches until 2 a.m. every night. And they don't even know if they like each other,
Right.
but they've been married for 50 years, so it's successful.
Right.
I think that part of it is because we have this definition of success in a relationship that isn't, in my opinion, accurate. I don't think time can be a marker of success in a relationship, but is certainly not the only marker, nor should it be. For me, success in a relationship is how you treat each other, how you care for each other, how you love each other, and how
Mhm.
you are in relationship with each other. But because the narrative for so long has been time, which if we go back to the roots of marriage, a lot of the roots of marriage was almost like a business
Right.
contract between families. And then we have, different spiritual beliefs on top of that. So when we go back, I think there's a lot around marriage that is just based on time and is outdated. But I do think that's still really embedded in our culture. And so if you did get separated and your mother or your grandmother has an opinion on the fact that you got a divorce, it sometimes feels really hard to then go back out into society or to your mother's house because you don't want to hear it. You don't want to be told again that you're a failure because you're divorced, or something didn't work out. You don't want to go to that Thanksgiving because you don't want Aunt Mary to question if you're going to see anyone new or have any kids at
Mhm.
some point. You don't want to go and see your friends because maybe they're all partnered already and you feel like the single person in your 30s or your 40s or your 50s or wherever, and you feel out of place. So I think that part of it is the actual separation. But I also think that a large part of it is our internalization of what we make that separation mean about us, about what we make it mean about relationships and society as a whole. So, for a lot of people, when the divorce happens, one of the narratives that tends to come up with my clients is, I should have seen this coming. I'm an idiot. How could I have not known that they were going to
Mm.
cheat? Or how could I have not known that they were going to turn into this person that I don't recognize? I should have known. I should have been able to avoid this. And there's
Mhm.
a lot of self shaming and blaming and getting stuck in that story. And then that perpetuates in different ways of, well, I'm not going to date again because this didn't work out. I don't want to be vulnerable. I don't want to get my heart broken again. Or it comes out in, maybe something's wrong with me. Maybe I am the problem. Maybe I did, miss something. And if only I was smarter, more pretty or successful, then they wouldn't have left. This wouldn't have happened. And I think that in part, it's just the stories we spin in our brain when we are in deep emotion and we're struggling because our hearts are broken.
Mm. There was like 7 tracks that came up as you were talking, and I'm like, I can't take us down all 7 at once. And so I'll choose one, but before I do that, I think something that really I'm just sort of allowing to percolate in the back of my brain is kind of when you talked about, if there's sort of a disagreement in what to do if that relationship, if you should have tried harder, you should have stayed married or stayed together, stayed, whatever it is, it can be really difficult if the people that would be your go-to supports
Mhm.
had a different opinion and weighed in on something. Instead of trying to empathize and understand what was best for you, they projected what felt best for them ultimately. And by doing that, they create isolation because you don't feel comfortable going back to them because now you should be over it. Now it's an inconvenience that you're still hung up on this thing that they already told you what to do and you didn't do it. So it's a very lonely thing in the midst of, for many of us that have had any sort of unhealthy, toxic relationship, so much of your identity becomes that relationship or you in that relationship. So once you've ended that, you're not only in this place of loss and grief and pain, but you're in this sort of identity crisis of, well, who am I? And I think that's where it's really easy for shame to come in. And so, one of the things that I think is, I'm curious your take on is when you talked about all those shoulds, all that sort of hindsight reflection, and then the future projections, it sounds like people end up taking a significant amount of responsibility. Again, they should have known better, and or they're the problem, which means that they're probably never going to have a healthy relationship. So then they should just not even try. They shouldn't burden someone else with that or take that on. Do you think that connects back to early life and maybe an experience with, I think about the bell hooks all about love, and a big thing that I took away from that was this idea of conditional versus unconditional love, and how most of us learned conditional love, whether that's listening to what your parents said, getting the good grades, dressing a certain way, falling in line. Do you think that that plays into it all, this sort of hindsight reflection, future fear projection piece as we think about that?
I do. I think that to some degree, we are all taught to people please and to
Mhm.
conform to someone else's behavioral standards or expectations of us. And I think this is not, I don't think anyone gets out of this. I think that's just the setup of our society to a large degree of, like you said, with parents. Different people have different parents. Some parents can be very overbearing emotionally or can have a very strict mentality or could be just simply emotionally or physically abusive to their children. And if you grow up in an environment like that, you are almost subconsciously growing up where you have to be able to see the micro changes in people because
Mm.
it means something for you. And you have to be able to adjust to those things. And if you don't adjust to those things in the right amount of time, then something's wrong with you.
Right.
You're bad. And that's how kids internalize it. So, depending on the family home, I think it can really have a deep impact. But I also think this is just something we see as a byproduct of society, as just part of what happens is we go to school and we are expected to behave, to get good grades,
Right.
to know the right answer, and also to do it alone, to work independently, to not look at someone else's paper. Like we are molded to do things the right way by someone else's expectations and to do it alone. And I think that it does have an impact on how we think as adults because when you look at adulthood, the script almost flips. You're still supposed to know all of the answers, but in order to quote unquote reach success, it involves a risk. Well, people are afraid of taking risks because for most of their life they've had a checklist of how to behave to get the, love or attention or care that they wanted, and then something just switches. And so I do think that in general we see it be harder as adults to navigate this because of our upbringing and because in part we're all conditioned to respond a certain way and to think about other people's perceptions of us and what other
Right.
people think.
Well, I even think about that of the number of people that, we're talking about romantic relationships predominantly, and we can connect that back to our caregivers and kind of thinking about how we learned how to love either through direct and indirect experiences. But I also think about this. I mean, every adult that I've ever interacted with, I mean, I'm pretty confident I can use the word every adult has talked about adult friendships are hard. Like,
Mhm.
but my daughter is 4 and she's got 74 best friends that are all coming over at some point. And I think it is that it's that fear of the risk component. And I
Mhm.
think a lot of that is this vulnerability piece, this rejection piece. And so I think for so many relationships, people end up staying, I call it the predictable shittiness. We stay in the predictable shittiness, the job, the marriage, the
Yeah.
friendships that you don't want to do the things they do anymore, but you keep doing it because at least you've got something. Because the
Yeah.
idea is if I get rid of this, the only other solution or the only other idea that I have is that it's going to be worse. I don't
Mhm.
have the belief it could be better, both because I don't feel like I deserve it, but also because the risk feels so overwhelming that my fear brain would rather just assume this is the best you're going to get. Learn how to be comfortable in this predictably shitty experience. And so when someone takes that step of going, yeah, no, I'm not going to do that. Not
Mhm.
only are you maybe isolated from, your mom, your aunt, your friend, whoever had a different opinion about your relationship because they weren't in it, but seem to think that they were and they know what's best. You feel alone from that, but now you've also gone against the grain. Not just you should be married for 38 years and that's a sign of success, but also you broke the mold. You believe you deserve something better. all the rest of us are still in that predictable shittiness hamster wheel. And we need you to get back on the wheel so that we can keep doing what we're doing. You're bringing too much tension to the narrative. So it feels like there's this cultural pressure then to stay silent so that you don't bring your problems, which you chose. You broke out of that. That's on you. You don't bring that to the table. And I think for many people, they don't even know how to support someone who does that because they don't realize they're likely doing the same thing. Maybe not in a marriage or a partnership, but in something else as well.
Yeah, this just made me have two lines of thought because I'm also someone who has many
Yeah, I was going
thoughts.
to say it's better than 7, so we're good. I like it.
Yes. The first thought I had was sometimes when we see someone going after what they want, it shows us where we're not in our life. And that can be a hard thing to interface with as a person. And it can lead to a lot of projection on other people. I have certainly done this in my life. I will own that. I think we all have seen someone really go after something and really break the mold and really do their thing. And we're just like, who do they think they are? Oh, they're
Right.
so much, they're too much, but secretly wishing that we did the same thing in our own way, in our own life. And so I do think that this is something that it can be hard and isolating from the fact that people judge because they want it, because they wish they could do that too, but something inside of them makes them think that they can't or they shouldn't, or they're going to be, rejected if they did. And then the other line of thought that I had was I also think that when we do speak up, when something is wrong in a relationship and we do take action and get out of the relationship, or we do speak up about it, there is such a culture, and I do think this is a cultural issue of, keep it under the rug, keep it hush, don't air your dirty laundry. They're willing to work on it, so why aren't you? That's a narrative I hear a
Yeah.
lot in, really toxic relationships. I'll hear stories of, I'm really frustrated because my ex keeps saying that they're willing to talk on it and have a conversation and do the work. And we've done that a million times. And it's like, yeah, you have done that a million times. So do you really want to do that again? Because they're saying something. And it's just, we as a culture can sometimes get stuck in the like blaming and ridiculing someone who is willing to speak up because they are speaking up, because they are drawing attention to an issue. And I think this is a cultural thing that we need to really look at and shift as a society, because I think it's keeping a lot of people silent when really we could do to have those voices be heard and recognized. And I think it's keeping a lot of really unhealthy dynamics playing out because people are afraid to speak up about it because they don't want to be seen as the person who is complaining or isn't, quote unquote, willing to work on the relationship when they have been doing that.
Right. Well, and then they run the risk of either being the asshole who then just like makes the other person look bad of like, well, let me actually give you all a list of the ways that we have done that. And then they're trying to prove it, which is just a competitive
Yes.
piece of like who's more right. It makes me feel back to being in middle school and you would quote
Mhm.
unquote break up. And then it was like you had to pick a side. And it's like, but there is no right side. It's just two people that don't want to be together, but you
Right.
don't see that. And so the pressure feels so big. And I think there's that element then of because we're so fixated on external validation, again, going back to conditional love, it's this belief that we need everybody to support the decision that we made and to
Mhm.
see us in a certain way, to feel like we're allowed to still be a part of whatever it is, the family, the community, the culture that we're in. And so that identity loss feels so overwhelming. But what's interesting is and obviously there's people like you and like me that want to have these conversations. And I love how you just basically said you're that person. I'm sure you can think of a client in your head too that you've done that with, where you can be the person that says, yeah, you don't have to do it again.
Yeah.
They can want that and you cannot, and you
Mhm.
can both be equally right.
Yes.
It is okay if those wants are different. And for many people, I'm assuming the difficult part is they've likely been that people pleaser that has allowed that other person's wants to supersede their own. And
Mhm.
so they've probably earlier times been like, I'm done. I don't want to work on it. This doesn't fit for me. But the other person says something, keeps them stuck in that sort of toxic cycle. And so they keep doing it to people please. And because, again, of that fear of rejection. And so by doing this, they're going, I'm choosing me, which is very scary. And again, that then feels like they're
Mhm.
standing alone. You also said there's this narrative then of like, well, it just takes time. So there's this like, well, if I just stay off the radar for a little bit and I'll just heal, it'll be fine. But that
Mhm.
doesn't happen. And we also know that we need connection and belonging to feel secure, to feel seen, to move on, to have healthy relationships. And so, how do they make that transition out of I've done this, I feel alone, I feel overwhelmed, I don't feel like I have any support, I don't know what to do? How do they then shift to the work part? How do they get out of that fear and take those steps?
So I think the first thing is to recognize that there are, how do I say this? I think the first thing is to have awareness over where you're at and the narrative you have been told, and just recognize, okay, this isn't working for me. I want to try something new. I want to try something
Mm,
different. And I think just having the ability to draw awareness of, oh, this way that everyone has been saying for me to do this doesn't actually work for me. And I'm going to try something new. I'm going to try something different. The transition into the work bit, what I start to introduce people to as I start asking the question, have you actually given yourself a chance to feel your feelings around this? Because 9 times out of 10, the answer is no. And when I say feel your feelings, I mean quite literally just feel your feelings without getting lost in a story about it. Just like allow yourself to feel without attaching meaning to it, without saying, I feel this way because of this way, and that means this is going to happen. Like try and get out of your head and into your body and feel, because so often we're shoving down those feelings, and shoving down those feelings is just saving them for later. And then we're wondering why these feelings keep coming up. And it's because they haven't actually been given that space to be felt. After the feeling portion and regulating and really taking a moment to ground, then I start probing the thoughts of like, what are you thinking about this? Like, what are you making this breakup mean about you? What are you making this breakup mean about your potential for love? What are you making this breakup mean about your worth as a person, your identity as a person?
oof.
What is your brain doing? Because if you can start to look at, okay, my brain is making this mean that I should have tried harder, I should have been better, then great. Now you can solve for those things.
Yep.
But trying to solve for everything under the sun is what often keeps people on the hamster wheel, wondering why they're not quote unquote healed yet, which I don't think there's ever such a thing as being fully healed. I think we're humans and humans go through cycles and we have ups and downs, and that's just part of being human. You know, doing the healing work does not get you out of being human. But I think that recognizing, oh, I keep having this thought that my worth is attached to my relationship. That's interesting. Maybe I should look at that. Maybe I should get curious about that and see if that's affecting me here. Where else might that be affecting me?
Hmm. I know. I think that meaning making piece, I wrote it down as you were talking because I think that is such a key point. Because there is that piece. For many people, I think emotional intelligence is something that we struggle with as a whole. And emotional intelligence meaning the ability to actually recognize, feel, move through our emotions. And many people don't even know how to name their emotions. They don't know what it is. They don't like it. And they've spent so many years trying to stuff it down or trying to reroute it to something that's more convenient. That's why we see people sort of defaulting to anger or things like that, because it feels like it's an easier thing and you get a little release when you yell at somebody or you punch a wall, but that's not actually helping you move through the fear or whatever that is. And my guess is at that point for a lot of people, it's also recognizing that nothing is all or nothing. And so it becomes very easy to kind of expect, well, if you left the marriage, if you left the relationship, you should be fine. And you should have no that
Mhm.
hands are washed. I don't love that person anymore. I don't have any fondness for that person anymore. So my guess is during that point, it's a lot of allowing the depth of feeling of knowing that you can still experience love and longing for a person that you can also choose not to be with, and learning how to
Yes.
integrate that. Because that, I mean, I still have that for a relationship that that I ended at 21. There were parts about who I became as a person, how I moved through very painful parts of my life when I was with this person that I still have love and longing for. And that is not the person that I wanted to invest in a longer relationship with. And so learning how to integrate both of those pieces, not making it so that you have to make them a villain, they're also not a hero. They're just a person. And your feelings towards them and the complexity of them as a person in the relationship, it feels like are really key. And so I'm guessing that's a lot of the emotional part that you have to do with people first. And then as you get to the cognitive part, it really is about the meaning piece. Because if it is that you're now taking it and writing this story that becomes sort of your central narrative, until you've made peace with that, knowing you can choose that, that's fine. And this is how it's affecting you. And, or you can choose something different. That doesn't have to be the meaning that we have of it. That doesn't have to be the conclusion that we draw. You can't really move forward and have any sort of chance of healthy relationships with other people because we don't know the dominant story yet. We don't know how you're coming into it. What do you think is, I guess there's a part of me that's making an assumption that a lot of the meaning is about themselves being the problem. And it could be what they're doing, but it could also be things like, I mean, you mentioned body image. I'm also thinking age. I know somebody in
Mhm.
my life who's in their 60s that got a divorce and they're like just shitting on themselves that they didn't do it sooner. They should have seen those things,
Yeah.
kind of like you said. And so now it's like, well, I'm this old. Am I deserving of this? And then as you sort of unravel one toxic relationship, you can start to see other toxic relationships. And so then that fear is,
Mhm.
well, if I get rid of all the toxic relationships, what do I have left? And again, and I'm old. So how am I going to meet more people? Is that kind of the dominant thing that you see, or is there something else that comes up for people with the meaning piece? And then what do we do with that? How do we actually move from, okay, that's the meaning I'm making of it, to I can choose a different meaning?
Yeah. So I do see a lot of self blaming. I do see a lot of self criticism, but I think I would almost say larger narrative I engage with or a similar size is writing off all relationships. And I'm never going to trust again. I'm never going to let someone in again. I'm never going to talk about this again. I'm never going to let someone get to know this piece of me again. And all men are like this. All women are like this. This happens to me all the time. It's always going to be this way. I would say that that is almost, if not a stronger force, like the more
Yeah.
forthcoming narrative that people tend to talk to me about.
Yeah.
And I think that the way we start to overcome these narratives, or even the idea of I'm too old to date, I'm too, I have no friends, I should have done this sooner. The way I think we start to overcome that is to pause and give ourselves compassion for being a human, having a human experience. And I know that can sound very blasé and like, just almost like, yeah,
Right.
okay,
Like a
we get
bumper
that.
sticker. Yeah.
Yeah, bumper sticker, like be proud of
Right.
yourself. But but where did you actually show up in this journey that you are proud of and that
Mhm.
you can look back and go, yeah, you know what? I am proud of myself. I am proud of myself for
Yeah.
trying. I am proud of myself for looking up the communication classes and going to counseling and being willing to work on something with someone. You know what? I'm actually am proud of myself. Even if it didn't turn out the way I wanted it to, I have those skills and I took the time to invest in that way. And yeah, I'm freaking proud of it.
Mm.
Maybe it's then, looking back and being like, you know what? I am actually proud for leaving. I had all of these reasons not to leave and I did. And just that moment. So like looking back and finding, even if it's tiny, where are you grateful for yourself? Where can you have compassion for yourself? Where can you be proud of how you showed up? And then I think the other piece of it, just to get the ball rolling, just to kind of look for those other choices and perspectives, is I use the practice of what other perspective could we take here. So I personally get fun with it when I do
Mhm.
it myself. I kind of look at it like, okay, if you were a detective, what would you think about this? If you were your 80-year-old self, what would you think about this? If you were your 12-year-old self, what would you think about this? If you were a random person in a different country looking at this relationship, what would you think? And it's just to get different thoughts and perspectives in. It's not to then choose a perspective to have. It's just to get your brain to think about different
Yeah.
things. Because when you are so close to the tree and you can't see the forest, it's difficult to move through it. And so bringing in those different ideas, those different perspectives, those different ways of thinking, it can just work your brain in a different way. Because if your neural pathway is so stuck on one story, or a set of stories about what the divorce means about you or the relationships you get to have or life. Sometimes it means something about
Yeah.
life for people. It's like, I no longer get to have a family. I no longer get to have my happily ever after. So if you can start to bring in different thoughts that you may at some point think, it can just show your brain something different and get your brain working in a different way, which sometimes that's a massive step for people to just even let another thought into the room
Hmm.
without shutting it down can be really, really big.
Yeah, I love that. I think for a lot of people, subjective interpretations become, in their mind, objective truths. So that it just
Yes.
becomes that that's the only conclusion that we can draw. And that all or
Mhm.
nothing thinking becomes that brain's kind of lazy, but also very rigidly trained way of just, I need it all to be sorted as yes or no, all or nothing, whatever that is. It also feels
Yeah.
like for many people, it's this like reclaiming of power. Like, well, I'm not going to let anybody else in because I have control over that because I couldn't control the fact that this went to shit or that this thing that I thought was going to happen ended this way, but I can control this. So no one is ever going to take advantage of me again. The reality is the only way to guarantee that is to go and live in a cabin in the woods by yourself and never interact with another human for the rest of your life. And asterisks, we know that that's not healthy. We cannot survive
Yeah.
that way. And so knowing that
Yes.
part of that space is saying, maybe right now, maybe that's where some of the emotional processing is. Right now, you need to feel power through anger and rage and distance. What that tells us, you're not past that feeling point yet to do that detective work. Okay, great. Let's stay here. No one is ever going to come into your life again. We want no relationships. No one is safe. Great. And then you kind of break that down and you do allow some of those things in. I think that key piece is coming back to you could still choose that original thought. Whatever that thought was,
Yeah.
you can still choose that. You have the
Yes.
power. That's where we're giving you the power. You also have the power to choose something different. And I think the piece that you said that's also really key is that compassion element. I think about there's things when I was 18, I thought partying until 2 or 3 in the morning and being hungover the next day was fun. Really loved it.
Yep.
Well, subjectively, I wanna tell myself I loved it. I'm sure in the moments it was also gross, but it's like what you did. But that was a thing I chose for fun. I am 36 and I can confidently tell you that I think going to bed after 9 PM is gross. I think you should be in bed. I do not if someone's like, "Do you wanna watch a movie? Do you wanna go out for drinks?" Absolutely not. I've got stuff to
No, you
do.
know what time it
Yeah,
is.
I am gonna take some magnesium. I am gonna go
Yeah.
get into bed, and I need some sleep. What fits for me now is not the same as what fits for me then. Some of those changes have to do with my self-worth. The friends that I had at that point are different from the friendships that I have now or that I seek out now. The way that I show up in those relationships looks different. But I think I spent a significant amount of time then basically cataloging the Kira that existed in those relationships and villainizing her instead of realizing that that
Mm.
Kira was doing the best that she could. And maybe the best that she could was to allow herself to have a relationship at all because she was so afraid of not having anything. This was protective. The Kira now has done the work since that time. So, kind of like you said, honoring the steps in the work. Because if I'm in a different position, it says I've done something. I've done some sort of reflection. The Kira now is in a different place of confidence, of truth, of tolerance that I want something different. And I am allowed to still celebrate and love the Kira that didn't make those choices or didn't feel like she had a different choice than what she was doing at that time. And so it sounds like a lot of it is really an integration of the full self and thinking about
Mm.
you at all of those different ages and times made the best decision possible given the information and the capacity that you had at that time. And so you need to
Absolutely.
give yourself that love in that space.
Yeah. And there's a couple of things that came through for me when you were saying that. The first is going back to emotions. Sometimes when we feel something really strongly, we just assume it's fact. We just assume it's the way it is because the feeling is so intense. And that's why going back to the feeling work, that I think that's why it's really important to look at the emotions and just allow yourself to process and feel them. Because I do think it's really hard to do thought and mindset work. You can do it, but it's just more challenging to do it when you're emotionally charged because then your brain's making a bunch of meaning about your
Yep.
emotions. And it's just, it's a lot quieter up there if you allow yourself to just process and feel what you're feeling and go, okay, I'm angry, but what's beneath that anger? Maybe it is actually sadness and grief, and just allow yourself to go through that journey. The second thing that came through for me was, looking back at the high school self, looking back at the 21-year-old self. And I think that the analogy that came into my head was actually keeping an old sweater from high school. I think we do this in our mentalities too, right? We have our closets and they've got that old, jersey from when you played soccer in the, 11th grade. And we hold on to it even though we never are going to wear it again. It's not even really part of our identity anymore. We don't want to go back to that time. How can we let that go? How can we allow ourselves to give thanks and honor that part of us who put in that effort, who had those experiences? But also, part of grieving a relationship, I think, is also grieving parts of ourselves
Mm-hmm.
and parts of our identity that aren't coming forward, whether that's because something has been lost or it doesn't fit anymore, like an old shirt from high school, but maybe also because it wasn't us to begin with. And like we were molding ourselves or we were trying to fit into someone else's box and we don't actually want to do that anymore.
Yeah.
And so I think that analogy of like, okay, where are the old sweaters in your closet? Where are the old identities in your mind, in your spirit as a person? And can you give thanks to that version of yourself, that, 10-year-old, 15-year-old, 30-year-old version of you?
Mm-hmm.
And also, can you give yourself permission to Marie Kondo it and choose
Yeah.
joy?
Yeah. And I think about that then if we add that layer of relationship being, I think for so many of us to be able to get rid of it, we almost feel like we have to make it all bad. And so it is really that coming back to, it's very rare that there is a human who is pure evil. Like they're literally very small percentage points of people that fit those diagnostic criteria and have no capacity for emotion and connection. While a relationship or a person can be incredibly toxic, for most of us that have gone through those relationships, there have been moments that have felt good. However, that happened. And so that is the part too, where I think that Marie Kondoing it piece can be giving compassion even to what the relationship was, and then recognizing that we're not dumping on the relationship. What we're doing is responding to behavior of the other person, of the two of us when we come together, whatever that is, and making a decision about how we're going to behave moving forward. And what I know in that moment then is I can't live my best life if I continue to choose this relationship. That doesn't mean that person has to be evil or bad. It means we are not able to be in a relationship for me to be the best self that I want to be. I'm choosing something different. I can honor that. I can, like you said, hold it, recognize it, and then kind of let it go.
Yeah. And something that came up for me as you were saying that is, I think that it's become, we started talking about toxic relationships, and I think there's a lot of power in the internet and mainstream media because it is getting this information out, but sometimes I think we can get hooked into terms
Yeah.
and start labeling our exes, oh, they were a
Yeah.
narcissist, they were, and it really is, when you take a step back and actually go to, a therapist, a psychologist, and get a diagnosis, it really is a small portion of people who actually have those traits and those tendencies. And so I think being aware also of where sometimes we're putting a label or putting someone in a category, sometimes it can actually hinder us from processing and moving
Yeah.
forward, because then we get stuck into that narrative.
Mhm.
And I think that on the other side of things, something that we haven't touched on because just the basis of the topic of getting out and navigating a divorce or breakup around a toxic relationship, I think we also don't see that a lot of the hardest breakups people go through is actually when there wasn't really anything
Yeah.
wrong. And really, it was just two people who did love each other, but the relationship wasn't compatible and they wanted different things. And that's a hard breakup to move through. When you love someone, when you're attracted to them, when you can see a life with them, but you just know you want different things, you have different ambitions, you don't actually work, that's a really challenging breakup to navigate. And it doesn't have to be because they're a bad person, it can just be the relationship.
Yeah.
The third thing that came up for me was I'm reflecting on my past breakups. And if you had told me at the time, I would have like probably cussed you
Yeah.
out because of how hard they were. But I also think sometimes I had a friend at the time tell me this when I was going through a particularly hard breakup. And it was sometimes you are allergic to a certain dynamic or allergic to a certain person, but that doesn't mean someone else is. It's like, you might be sensitive to gluten, but that doesn't mean everybody is. And if you had told me at the time, I would have been so mad. But I also think, like, of course, perspective. I look back in those situations and I go, oh, yeah, that dynamic wasn't healthy. It was toxic, but it wasn't about that
Yeah.
person. It was in part about the dynamic. It was because it wasn't a good fit for me. It was because my shit and their shit didn't
Yeah.
match and we couldn't handle it. Or we were young. We didn't have the skills. We didn't, we were at a different time in our lives. But I do think sometimes taking a pause, and again, depending on where you are in the breakup or the separation, this might be really hard to do, but just taking a pause and going, okay, am I labeling this X as the villain here? Am I putting this all on them too? And is that helping me really?
Right.
Like, is that really helping me feel better? Is that really true? Is that really allowing me to move forward? And again, you don't have to choose a different thought. I think that's the best thing about thought work is you don't actually have to choose something different. You can decide to go back to that thought, but then it's a
Yep.
decision as
Ownership.
opposed to a default.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. And I do think that is the piece for a lot of us is taking radical ownership of what's ours while learning to let go of the things that aren't. And so that like trying to fix other people, trying to make everybody else understand, trying to get approval, trying to be fine, that's all for the external piece. You don't need to be fine to still be functioning. I have that conversation a
Yeah.
lot when I do corporate work. We don't need your employees to be happy. Happiness does not correlate to good work. That is not the goal. Their emotional state is independent of their ability to get their job done. What we need is people that feel free to feel whatever they're feeling and know that that feeling can be with them and they are still more than that feeling. And so I think for a
Mhm.
lot of us, it's that piece overall and just really coming to terms with, look, relationships are on the same level of air, water, food. Like we need connection at that same level for
Yes.
survival. And this is the most difficult thing we will ever do is connect with other people because the
Yeah.
dynamic of interacting with other people has so many different variables, so many different things to consider. And so instead of, I think, getting stuck, it sounds very similar to how we started this idea of the checklist, the metrics for success. We have to just really come back to and get in touch with what feels right to us, what feels good
Yeah.
in our bodies, in our emotional sense. How do I show up in this relationship? Do I like the version of me that comes through? And if I don't, what's mine to own and decide to work on or not? And what's theirs? And I think, like you said, even looking back at some relationships, what is just a product of two things that don't react well together? I think peanut butter and jelly is actually gross. I don't like it together. I don't want to eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It does not excite me. I think peanut butter and Nutella, great, great plan. There's a lot
Mhm.
of people that want peanut butter and jelly. That doesn't make me bad for not wanting to eat that. It just means I have a different preference. And so it sounds like as we wrap, sort of the takeaway for people is to give themselves space to have their own story and to allow that story to be, what's the word I'm even like, in flow, in a constant state of flux, because we can reserve the right that it is not a static thing. It evolves as we evolve.
Yeah, absolutely. You have the right to change your mind, right? And I think that going back to how you've said it earlier in our conversation, it's just sometimes we can be very all or nothing. We can be very, this is
Yep.
it, this is set in stone. But really, life is very cyclical. There's a lot of ups and downs. We have a lot of changings of opinions, and opinions and thoughts also change with perspective and experience through life. And going through different relationships and having different, even your relationship with yourself and how that relationship changes. So I do think that really recognizing where your thoughts are coming into play and what story you're telling yourself and knowing that you have a bit of choice around that, a lot of choice around
Yeah.
that, I think is really powerful. And also something that just came up for me is we've threaded through this conversation, but just the importance of connection. It can be really hard to reach out for connection, especially if you are afraid of rejection from people.
Mhm.
But I do think that's why I personally view getting an outside perspective as so helpful, or find the people you can trust, find the people who can hold your heart for a while, because there's a lot of relational blips that happen that I think can only really be resolved when we are in relationship with someone
Yeah.
else. Like we can't do relationship work solo alone. That's not, it's a relationship with ourselves, but it's not being in relationship with someone else. There are certain skills and stories that need to be worked through while in relationships with other people. So I think where you can, do seek out that support. Maybe that is a trusted friend, but I also think that's the power of hiring a therapist or a
Yeah.
coach, is just someone who's neutral, someone who is not involved in your life or has any stake in that
Right.
game
And
socially.
then is gonna say sometimes the shit that you don't wanna hear because that's their job,
Yes.
instead of the fear of
Yes.
how your relationship is gonna feel that's affecting the 2 of
Right.
you.
100%.
This is a perfect way to wrap, because I'm thinking as we were going through this, I'm like, okay, there are a lot of people listening to this episode that are like, okay, I need more Lucy in my life. And so you might be that person for them that they're like, wow, she sees this and she takes it seriously through a lens that I've struggled to have people in my life. Again, I think a lot of the people, like you said, that come to you, maybe they've tried talking to friends, they've tried talking to family, they've tried these things, and it just hasn't felt like they've gotten what they need. And so, for people that are listening and go, okay, I want to do that next level of work. I'm holding on to a relationship from 10 years ago, or I'm fresh into a breakup and I don't want to get stuck in that cycle. What's the best way for them to connect with you?
I'm very active on Instagram, and I'm very much the person who slide into my DMs. I do look at them, I do read them, feel free. But I would also say my website is also a very good place to go. And the website is www.shiftyourstory.net. All of my handles are lucy.m as in Michaela.price. And I'm pretty active to respond. So I would say reach out. What the process tends to be is we'll talk a little bit, we'll hop on a call, you'll get to know me, I'll get to know you, we'll see if we're a fit and we can take it from there.
I love that. And I really, if you're in that on that fence as a listener right now, just go. I'll make sure that all the links are in the show notes. Go to her Instagram page and just kind of check out some of those reels, some of those ways that I think she introduces these topics. There's one she did not too long ago that talked very specifically about, why do I still have feelings for my ex and why am I not over this? And she does a really great job of validating and then also empowering you. So, again, really that balance between the emotional work and the cognitive work. And so I think just continue to take in some of those messages. And then when you decide that you are ready, then yeah, slide into her DM, send her an email, make that connection. It is a risk. It is always vulnerable to put ourselves out there and to ask for help. And if you found yourself feeling safe in this conversation, it is a risk that might be worth taking, because that safety and security is one of the most beneficial things for us to continue to do this work and to get out of those shame stories that we feel like have been sort of dumped on us for so long. Lucy, this has been amazing. Thank you so much. I feel like we could talk for 8 more hours and
Yes.
we still wouldn't even have like fully scratched the surface on this topic. And so I feel like it's been such a gift for everybody to get the chance to connect with you in this way. I appreciate it so much. Listeners, as you finish this episode, give yourself permission to just kind of take a second to let all this information just kind of percolate for a little while. And maybe you pick one thing, just one thing you're going to take with you. I know for me, I'm really going to sit with that. What meaning am I making? Because I think that does really help me shift to a place of empowerment as I think about so many of the different types of relationships that I'm reflecting on, working through, navigating in my life right now. As always, we will be back next Sunday with another guest. Make sure again that you go into the show notes, check out all of Lucy's amazing spaces, places, and ways to connect with her. And of course, share this episode with someone else you think could benefit from hearing it. Until then, we'll see you next Sunday.